We're bringing you all the news from Flame 2018. I'm Sasha Twining. With me now is Dimitru Dediu, who's an associate partner at McKinsey's in the Amsterdam office. Dimitru, thank you very much for your time and talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start with something that Shell was talking about, and they were talking about an impending LNG shortage, maybe in the mid-2020s.
Right.
What are your views on that? Do you think that's a real risk?
Right, so, it's a risk and an opportunity. So we do see, because of a growth demand that will continue, particularly driven by Asia Pacific, so that is to say China and many other Southeast Asian economies, we'd see demand growing from 300 today to 400 going forward. And given the capacity that is today, we'll see a supply gap of around about 100 million tons per annum, opening up by the end of next decade.
So who's going to be able to actually capture that supply and make use of that then?
Right, so it's going to be a mix of conventional projects, that is to say projects in the Middle East, maybe Russia, and some projects in East Africa, but also it's going to be projects in the US, and we'll see US actually playing a bigger role in supplying into Asia Pacific.
What's the balance, do you think, though, between all of that? Will it be mainly US or closer? What do you think?
No, so we'll see, for instance, from this 100 MTPA, million tons per annum, we'll see about 25 million tons per annum from Qatar alone. And then the rest will be projects in East Africa, maybe Russia, maybe some other conventional projects around the world. And possibly the gap will be filled in by projects from the US.
And do you think those projects are going to be new projects coming on, or ones that maybe are just increasing export?
So it's been a combination of expanding the existing plants, but also going to be new projects that are sort of brownfield projects. That is to say, regas terminals, traditionally import terminals, will be retrofitted into export terminals in the US.
Now, obviously, everyone wants to keep, well, on a supply side, they want to keep the prices down. So we're going to see more competition, do you think, within those existing projects as well?
That's right. And here we talk quite a bit about cost innovation in the US and how all the projects also in the US, but also around the world, are trying to compete with each other and to keep the cost of LNG down. And we see in the US, many of the projects are competitive and economic, around about $7 to $7.5 per MMBtu delivered LNG into Asia. And that will set quite a material marker for the global LNG projects, and all projects will have to beat this price level.
So how are they going to keep those prices down, though? I mean, is this totally new innovation, or is it cost cutting out? You tell me, how is it going to be done? Right.
So it has to be innovation. It has to be keeping costs down. It has to be new commercial structures. It has to be working closer and better with suppliers to actually deliver the project. And projects that simply cannot meet the bar, they will not be delivered.
And do you think that's the case, that actually there are projects which are now coming online now, which we won't even be talking about in a few years' time?
Right, so the projects that are now being constructed most likely will be delivered. So these are already launched, and we will see, once the project is post-FID, so post-final investment decision, they will be completed. Now, what we do see is around about 1,100 million tons of capacity announced as pre-FID, so pre-investment decision. And from these 1,100 MTPA of capacity, we will see around only 100 MTPA actually being sanctioned to be built. So there will be only 10% of those projects that have been announced will actually make it. So it will be a massive competition going forward.
How difficult is it then to get investment into projects at the moment if such a low percentage will actually be going forward?
Right, so we'll see, some are privileged, like the ones that have privileged upstream gas resources, like the ones in Qatar or some parts around the world. But some will have to work very closely with suppliers, to keep the costs down and actually deliver this project at the lowest cost possible. So there will be quite a bit of innovation that will be needed on all levels.
Talk to me about contract length, because it sounds like when you talk about innovation, keeping costs down, all of that, that sounds to me like very short contracts. Is that always now going to be the way forward?
Well, we do see a preference for the LNG buyers towards shorter term contracts, and the definition of longer term contracts actually has shortened from 20-25 years to 15 to 20 years. And we do see a lot of projects in the US actually need long-term contracts to secure funding through their banks for the project. Now, the big question will be is how these contracts will be made and whether buyers are willing to accept Henry Hub pricing for these contracts, and or whether they will push for oil linked or European hubs types of pricing that will be preferred for many of the European buyers.
Do you think, though, that actually those prices are stable enough and the projections are stable enough to allow people to do that?
Right. So we see Henry Hub actually being relatively stable over the last years, and there is an enormous space of resource base that can supply gas at around about $3 or even less. Today the Henry Hub is at $2.8 per MMBTU. And we see going forward with competition with renewables and actually gas supplies in the US keeping costs down and I have figuring a way to produce gas at a relatively low price. You will see Henry Hub actually being rather stable, at least for the coming decade.
What about an Asian trading hub? What are your views there?
Right, so there are multiple elements that need to come in place for an Asian hub to happen. And there are many contenders for this one hub, because very likely it's going to be just one hub because of liquidity, because of scale that is needed to have one hub. Now, and we see Japan, China, Singapore, many other places competing for this one place. Now, at the moment, there is no one clear winner because one, you need to have well-developed infrastructure, you need to have a big market, you have to have also standardized products and have enough liquidity and depth in the market to enable such a hub. Now we see all of these places like Japan, China, Singapore, India, Indonesia, all having some limitation to some extent to establish this hub. And we're working with some of our clients actually to see how we can contribute to overcome some of these hurdles and develop the right infrastructure, regas infrastructure, thinking about the contracting, thinking around how to bring both buyers and suppliers in the same marketplace to look at creating such a hub.
What's your gut reaction though? What do you think? You know, if we were standing here in, let's say, 5 years.
All right.
5 years actually sounds like a very long time now. But you know, would we see one, and where would it be?
Right, so I would say it's I don't know one specific.
Okay.
But I would say it's most likely should be China, Singapore, or Japan.
If I were to bet.
Yeah. If I were to bet.
That's very much spread betting.
Yes, indeed.
Very, very much so. What about the Panama Canal?
Right.
Tell me your thoughts on that.
So Panama Canal has extended recently, and that has enabled LNG cargoes to go through Panama Canal into to Asia, to land in Asia, and that has enabled this new route has enabled U.S. LNG exporters to supply Asia at much lower cost. Now, what we see is currently there is 1 or 2 slots per day out of 12 that is required for LNG. Going forward, given the increase in U.S. supply, we would see this going up to 3 or 4 slots. Now, there could be a number of things that could happen, either congestion or the fees for the Panama Canal potentially coming under pressure, competing with cargo vessels or container vessels for the passage.
Let's look ahead. Well, I said 5 years earlier. Shall I just say 2 years now? Let's say we were here not next year, but the year after.
Right.
What sort of conversations would we be having? Because I think it's fair to say there have been a few surprises in the marketplace. So in maybe 2 years from now, what will we be talking about?
Right. So we'll probably see a much more focus on contracting and contract renegotiations, given that many U.S. Contracts or U.S. exports competing with oil-linked contracts in Asia, and we see quite a gap between the cost at which U.S. can land and the oil-linked contracts in Asia, especially at higher oil prices. So that we'll see much more discussion around gas contracting, gas contract arbitration, renegotiations coming forward, as well as how will the gap be filled.
Yes.
So now we're just starting these discussions and we see some of the projects actually competing, but then we'll see even more competition for how this gap will be supplied.
I tell you what, as Flame goes on over the next few days, there'll be a lot of people who are trying to position themselves to be the ones.
Absolutely.
It'll
Yes.
be interesting to see who takes you to one side for a chat
Right.
as well. Dimitru, thank you very much for speaking to us at Flame 2018. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.